TellTale's Walking Dead has a lot more going on in it than my younger self realized. Now, that's not to say I disliked it when I was young. I loved it to death. But upon re-examination, it's one of the most tightly written, well-considered narratives I've ever played through. This essay is going to be divided into two parts. Firstly, we're taking a look at what I consider to be the main themes throughout the game, and discuss what the moral of the story might be. And secondly, we'll be taking a more objective look at how much choices should matter in branching narrative games, using The Walking Dead as the main example. I've included a timestamp in the description if you'd like to skip to the second section. Through the dialogue and framing of The Walking Dead, the game frequently asks which is more important, family or friends. The apocalypse is a great backdrop to ask this question. We see fractured families joining and leaving our group of survivors, and it seems every character sits in a different spot on the spectrum when it comes to how much they value family versus friends. Herschel Green, whose farm you visit at the beginning, values family over everything else.
Family's important. It's all that matters. You agree with that?
And when his son is killed while everyone else is saving Kenny's son, Duck, he immediately kicks everyone off his property, leaving himself alone to ride out the apocalypse. If we hadn't seen him surviving later on in the comics and TV show, it would be safe to assume he died alone on his farm. He put his family above everything else, and strictly speaking on what's seen in the game, he pays the price for it when he's left alone. We'll take a look at another example on the opposite side of the story and the opposite side of the question, the people of Crawford. In Crawford, the group's survival came before everything else. The sick, the young, and the elderly were forced to leave the town, and any pregnancies would be terminated. The sacredness of family that Herschel valued so much was completely abandoned in Crawford in favor of the survival of the group, but ultimately that was their downfall. One woman who was scheduled for an abortion murdered the doctor who would have performed it, and all of Crawford's citizens became walkers as a result.
I think we know what happened to Crawford.
So, strictly looking at these two examples, it would seem The Walking Dead's answer to the question lies somewhere in the middle. Family is important, but so is the group. You can't completely abandon either. However, as I go over a few more instances of family imagery in the game, it seems The Walking Dead rests a little bit more towards the group survival answer. Consider Kenny, whose family is easily the most prominent in the game. Kenny starts out as strong and resourceful, happy to look out for his group as long as his family is safe first. It seems like he's a model example of The Walking Dead's ideal survivor. However, when his family is killed halfway through the game, he instantly loses himself and never quite recovers. I can't knock him for it, his family's death is one of the most tragic moments in gaming, but his unwillingness to cooperate with the group afterwards is what leads to one of Ben's potential deaths, and can get him into all sorts of other troubles depending on how Lee handles his grief. In Episode 4, Ben confesses to stealing supplies from the motel in Episode 3. He was giving them to bandits to keep them off the group's back, and when they don't get their supplies from him, they attack the group, and ultimately walkers manage to bite Duck as a result. Though it was all a freak accident, Duck's death and Katya's suicide can be traced back to Ben. When Ben confesses to Kenny, Kenny instantly wants to kill him, and when Ben's life is on the line shortly after, Kenny insists that you let him die. However, if you save him, when you get back to the mansion, Kenny pushes Ben just a little too far, and Ben goes off on him, revealing that he doesn't even know if his family is still alive, because he hasn't gotten to see them since the apocalypse started.
Lee should have left your ass in Crawford. We got enough problems. Fuck you, Kenny!
Kenny, stop!
No, let him.
I am so sorry about Katya and Duck. I am! And I know I fucked up. But stop pushing me around and stop wishing I was dead! No! You know how they die. You've said goodbye. I never got to see my family, my parents, my little sister. Do you get that? Your family is gone, but at least you had them to lose. I never made it home. They could be alive or dead or...
While Ben started out weak, he was able to suppress his emotions about his family until this moment, and ultimately ends up stronger than Kenny because of it. When Kenny realizes that he and Ben are in the same boat, he gets off his back completely, and ultimately ends up risking his life, probably fatally, to put Ben out of his misery before walkers can get him. Upon realizing he had common ground with one of the survivors, he was finally able to put the group ahead of himself again. This next example, in my opinion, solidifies The Walking Dead as saying that the group's survival is more important than just the families. The St. John family puts their survival above any and all moral considerations, cannibalizing any survivors that they think are likely to die.
The hell happened to your legs, man?
Don't eat dinner.
It seems that The Walking Dead is saying that only considering your family's well-being can drive you to doing horrible things. If they wanted to keep Lee's group on their good side, they could have survived for years through the upkeep of the family's farm. They could have easily produced enough food for all of the survivors, and been well defended while doing so with all of the people Lee had with him at that point. It was ultimately their obsession with keeping their family safe and fed that led to their downfall, and the potential deaths of all three of them. Obviously, if a family were to cannibalize people in real life, the takeaway wouldn't be that you can't be too obsessed with your family's survival. But, in good art, things are only included if they help build on ideas or support the themes of the work. It's perfectly rational to read into things more subjectively when we're talking about fiction. Fiction is designed, while life is practically random. The last example that's literally shown to us in the game is the stranger, the man who kidnaps Clementine. He was driven completely insane by the loss of his family. When he took his son out hunting, and the son got killed, he became estranged from his wife, and when Lee's group took the supplies from his station wagon, their fates were set in stone. His wife left with his daughter and died the next day, and this is what pushed him over the edge. He keeps his wife's zombified head in a bowling ball bag, and talks to her as he schemes to kidnap Clementine so that he can rebuild his family. Like the St. John's, he was driven completely insane by his inability to let go of his family, of the old world, and make the switch to group survival. The last major point throughout the entire game I'd like to touch on revolves around Lee and Clementine, the two main characters. From the very beginning, we see Lee trying to cope with his detachment from his family, and shortly after we see Clementine trying to do the same. Because of Lee's well-roundedness and Clem's hope that her parents might still be alive, they're both able to put their families aside and press on, with consideration for the whole group at the front of their minds. However, the issue of their families is in the back of their minds and dialogue alike. Seemingly, the game wants people to abandon old-world ideals like family and focus on the new world, where a family unit is simply too small to have any long-term success. There are plenty of smaller examples of families being unable to adjust to group life, and the bulk of the footage I recorded during my most recent playthrough revolves around this. So rather than tirelessly list them all, I'll show that footage as we move on to the next topic of discussion. How much should the player character's choices matter in a branching narrative game like this one? How much should the narrative branch? Choices without tangible gameplay consequences can be just as important as ones with. Consider the Captain's Dilemma mission in Prey 2016. A short little side mission in which you have to decide whether to destroy an escape pod that could contain an alien mimicking any random object. Whether you destroy it or not, your ending isn't affected, nothing changes in-game, and it doesn't even affect your kill count. However, this quiet, inconsequential moment was one of the most memorable parts of the whole game for me. In games that are built around player decisions such as Prey or The Walking Dead, the thoughts in the player's head are nearly as important as what's actually happening on screen. One of the main complaints I remember hearing when The Walking Dead came out was that most of your choices didn't result in much change in the plot, offering instead the illusion of dramatic change. Take Carly and Doug for example. Regardless of which one of the two you save in Episode 1, they both appear to help you out during the climax of Episode 2, and they're both killed by Lily at the end of the first act of Episode 3. Seems a bit disappointing from a mechanical standpoint, but each character has a very distinct personality, and your reasoning for why you saved whichever you saved is never asked by the game. It exists only in the player's head. Because of this, you feel a much deeper connection to them and their eventual death than if they were bland, nameless characters. There's a lot more going on in Lee's head than we actually get to make him say. That's a tried and tested way of making the player link to the player character. You're limited in what you can make Lee say, but his personal thoughts are entirely and subconsciously under your control. The point of this game isn't to explore a million different ways this journey could go, but instead to test your morals, and ask when enough is enough as far as siding with individual characters go. Your friends will all act irrationally sometimes, and choosing whether or not to side with them leads to meaningful consequences inside the player's head, even if all roads ultimately lead to home. Consider Fallout New Vegas. Some players might choose not to do any drugs or drinking throughout their entire playthrough for the purposes of role-playing. And while, as far as I know, the game won't ever acknowledge that, every time you choose not to drink or use a drug that could help you in a sticky situation, you're building on your own personal mythos for your character. Fallout New Vegas does have wildly varying outcomes, but the point of The Walking Dead's choice system isn't to explore that same level of branching storytelling. It's to put you in Lee's shoes. Doing multiple playthroughs in a row, you might be annoyed by how little impact your decisions have, but if you do a playthrough, say, every few years, you'll be surprised not by the changes in the storyline, but by the changes in your thought process. You're an entirely different Lee playing this game a few years later, and while you might go on a similar journey, the thoughts you're having will be entirely different. I'm reminded of a Solid Snake quote at the ending of Metal Gear Solid 2.
I know you didn't have much in terms of choices this time. But everything you felt, thought about during this mission is yours. And what you decide to do with them is your choice.
We have all the freedom in the world to feel however we want as we go through The Walking Dead. And with the questions I mentioned earlier, we have plenty of things to cycle through that thought process. A Fallout game would suffer from all paths taking you on the same journey, but The Walking Dead is much closer to a movie, and the choices we do get to make serve to put us in Lee's shoes. I can't say I blame the people who knocked The Walking Dead for not branching enough, but if you replay it every few years, rather than consecutively, you'll be surprised by just how different your story is than last time.